I woke up strapped to a cold metallic table, a strange buzzing sound echoing in my ears. I tried to move, but my limbs were restrained by some kind of high-tech energy field. Panic set in for a moment, but I quickly realized that the worst part of the situation wasn't being held captive. It was the two alien sisters hovering over me, their enormous frames making me feel like a bug under a magnifying glass. Zyra, the taller of the two, towered over me, her shiny exosuit reflecting the eerie light. Kira, her younger sister, was slightly smaller but no less intimidating, with a sleek black suit that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural glow. They both stared at me with intense, unwavering interest. Neither of them spoke for a few moments, which only made the situation more uncomfortable. Finally, Zyra broke the silence, her voice deep and confident, almost as if she were trying to hypnotize me with her words. "We are here to understand your anatomy," she said, her tone a mix of curiosity and clinical detachment. "We have studied many species, but humans remain an anomaly. You are the perfect specimen for our research." I blinked rapidly, trying to process her words. "Wait, hold on a second," I sputtered. "You mean to tell me you've abducted me to study my body?" I laughed nervously, trying to mask the panic. "And you think I'm some kind of perfect specimen?" Kira tilted her head, completely serious. "Yes, we have observed your species for quite some time. But we need to know more about your firmness. We believe it is essential for leadership qualities." I froze, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "Firmness?" I repeated, my mind racing. "Are you talking about my muscles or something?" Zyra gave me a slow, deliberate nod, her eyes scanning me up and down like a scientist studying a rare specimen. "Yes, but more specifically your physical firmness. We assume that it is an indication of your strength, power, and potential for dominance." I could feel a bead of sweat form on my forehead. "Look, I don't know where you're from or how your species works, but that's not how it works here. Firmness, as you call it, doesn't mean what you're thinking." Kira's eyes widened, and she quickly looked at her sister. "So, it is not a sign of leadership?" Zyra seemed deep in thought for a moment before shaking her head. "Then what is it?" she asked, genuinely confused. I opened my mouth to explain, but words failed me. What was I supposed to say? How do you explain something like human emotional and physical intimacy to two alien sisters who couldn't even grasp basic concepts like love or affection? Before I could come up with a response, Kira stepped forward, a mischievous glint in her eye. "We must test it," she said, practically purring the words. "You will help us understand." She reached out, running her fingers lightly along my arm. The sensation was electric, and I could feel my body involuntarily responding. My heart rate spiked, and my mind went into overdrive trying to make sense of the situation. These aliens were clearly misunderstanding something crucial about human nature. Still, I wasn't in a position to argue, or escape for that matter. "Test it? Are you serious?" I said, a nervous laugh escaping my lips. "What exactly do you want to test?" Zyra looked at me with that same intensity, her eyes narrowing slightly. "We need to see if your firmness extends beyond mere muscle," she said, leaning in closer. "We want to know how it affects your emotional state." Kira's expression mirrored her sister's, and it became clear to me that they were not just intrigued, they were determined to figure out what made humans tick. What made me tick? I couldn't help it. I laughed, partly because of the absurdity of the situation, partly because of how terribly wrong they were about human biology. "Emotional state? I'm sorry, but this is ridiculous. You think I'm going to let you experiment on me?" Zyra's expression shifted slightly, as if considering my words. But then she straightened up and nodded. "We understand that your species values consent. We will conduct this research with your cooperation. But understand this, you are part of something much bigger now." Kira, unable to contain her excitement, jumped in. "This is for science," she said, her voice high-pitched with glee. "We need to know everything. Your species' emotional responses, your physical reactions, everything." I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm despite the insanity of the situation. All right. You want to learn about human anatomy? Fine. But let me make something clear. What you're calling firmness isn't what you think it is. It's about emotions. Human emotions. Zaira and Kira exchanged looks, clearly confused by the concept I was trying to explain. Their blank expressions told me they had no idea what I was talking about. I rubbed my temples, trying to think of a way to explain this in a way they could understand. This was turning into something far more complicated than I had ever imagined. Okay, I said, trying to maintain a semblance of composure. You want to study firmness, but you also need to understand that it's tied to. I stopped myself, unsure of how to phrase this. It's tied to emotions like trust, attraction, and connection. It's not just about strength. It's about vulnerability. The sisters looked at each other, as if I had just spoken a foreign language. Then, Zaira leaned forward with a curious tilt of her head. Vulnerability? You mean a weakness? No. Not weakness. I quickly corrected, panicking slightly. It's a strength. Humans form emotional bonds, and that's what makes us strong. That's what firmness really is. There was a long pause as they absorbed this information. Finally, Kira spoke, though her voice sounded more bewildered than before. So, firmness is not about muscles or physical strength. It's about feelings? I nodded slowly, realizing how strange this must sound to them. Exactly. Feelings. We're not just about what we can lift, or how hard we are. It's about how we connect with others on an emotional level. That's what makes us strong. Zaira took a moment to process this, and for a brief second, I saw a flicker of realization in her eyes. She glanced at Kira, then back at me. We will need to test this, emotional firmness as well. I sighed, knowing this was only the beginning of their bizarre, and undoubtedly uncomfortable research. The tension in the air was palpable as the two sisters studied me intently. Kira's eyes sparkled with curiosity, while Zaira's gaze was more analytical. It was clear they didn't quite understand the human concept of emotional connections, and frankly, I wasn't sure how much I could teach them before they decided to turn me into some kind of experiment for their own amusement. We need to test it more thoroughly, Zaira said, her voice now taking on a tone that I could only describe as authoritative, like she was assigning me some kind of task I had no say in. We have understood physical firmness, but we need to know how it correlates with your emotional state. I rubbed my temples, trying to stay calm. And how exactly do you plan on testing that? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Do I just lay down and tell you how I'm feeling? Kira tilted her head in confusion, clearly not getting the joke. We don't need you to lie down, but we must study the effects of your emotional state on your physical firmness. I stared at her, completely dumbfounded. You're asking me to, get emotionally vulnerable in front of you so you can study my physical reactions? Yes, she said eagerly, as though this was the most reasonable thing in the world. Zaira nodded, clearly taking the matter seriously. We believe this will give us a complete understanding of your species' emotional structure. You cannot fully comprehend the firmness without experiencing it firsthand. I almost choked. Oh, so now we're doing emotional experiments? Yes, Zaira replied firmly, her eyes scanning my face like she was reading some sort of manual on how to emotionally break me. It's for the sake of interspecies understanding. You must help us. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to think of a way out of this without just flat-out refusing. Okay, fine, I said reluctantly, my mind already plotting my escape as soon as I had a chance. But you need to understand something first. Human emotions, they're not something you can just test on command. It's not like flipping a switch. Kira's brow furrowed. Then how do we access this emotional firmness? I sighed, feeling the weight of the situation pressing on me. Look, emotions are complicated. You can't just make me feel something by saying it out loud. It's about real connection, real chemistry. You can't just study it like a scientific phenomenon. Zaira crossed her arms, clearly unimpressed. Your explanation is insufficient. We need a practical demonstration. Great, I muttered under my breath. Because nothing says connection like being strapped to a table by two alien sisters who think they're about to conduct some kind of emotional surgery. Kira smiled, apparently thrilled by the idea of demonstration, and stepped closer to me. What if we try physical proximity? She suggested, her tone a bit too innocent for my liking. Would that help you connect? I nearly recoiled, but I forced myself to stay calm. No. Physical proximity is not how it works. You need to learn to understand emotional boundaries, and that comes from trust, not from getting up in my personal space. Zyra raised an eyebrow at me. You imply that your emotional state is controlled by boundaries? Yes, I said, suddenly feeling like I was talking to a couple of toddlers who had never been told no. Humans are social creatures, but we still need space. Emotional connection comes when both people feel comfortable, not when one person is trying to invade the other's personal space. The sisters exchanged glances. It was obvious they were trying to process the idea of space. In their culture, it seemed personal space was more of a suggestion than a rule. They were used to being close, both physically and emotionally, without any hesitation. Kira was the first to speak up. So, you require trust first, and then physical closeness? Exactly, I replied, glad to see they were starting to get it, at least on some level. But trust isn't built by just standing next to someone. It takes time, patience, and… Before I could finish, Kira stepped closer, and this time, I couldn't ignore the immediate tension that flooded my body. The air between us seemed to shift, and I felt a wave of heat crawl up my neck. What if we try a small test? Kira said, her voice now lower, tinged with something I couldn't quite place. I stiffened. What kind of test? She smiled, and my stomach sank. A test of proximity. To see how it makes you feel. Zyra gave her an approving nod. Yes, this will help us understand the limits of your emotional firmness. It was clear they were dead serious, and I had no choice but to play along if I wanted to make it out of there in one piece. Fine, I said through gritted teeth. But this doesn't mean you've figured out anything about human emotion. Kira moved closer, her suit shimmering with each step she took. I could feel my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to stop her, but my body couldn't seem to obey. The atmosphere in the room shifted again, and suddenly, I found myself more than a little self-conscious. She was practically standing on top of me now, and as she bent slightly forward, I felt my chest tighten. My body was betraying me. I tried to maintain my composure, but the whole situation was just too surreal. An alien sister standing way too close, studying my every reaction like some kind of lab rat. This is unnecessary, I muttered, trying to look away, but her eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel the tension intensify. It was like she could see straight through me, right into my thoughts. She smiled again, this time a little too knowingly. You say that, but I can feel the shift in your emotional state. Your heart rate is elevated. Your body is responding to the closeness. I couldn't help the awkward laugh that escaped my lips. Yeah, well, I'm human. We're not robots. Of course, my body's going to react. Zyra crossed her arms, eyeing us both like a coach overseeing a particularly awkward training session. Interesting. So, this emotional response is based on physical proximity, but only when there is attraction? Attraction? I nearly choked. No, it's not that simple. There's a lot more to it. It's about mutual connection, understanding, and… Before I could finish, Kira leaned in just a little closer, and the line between uncomfortable and too close for comfort blurred completely. We are trying to understand human, she said, her voice now a mix of curiosity and something else, something deeper, more dangerous. The problem wasn't just the proximity. It was that despite everything, I could feel myself drawn to her, the strange mix of alien and human making this encounter both fascinating and incredibly, awkwardly intimate. I wanted to protest, but I didn't know how. So instead, I focused on the one thing I could control, my words. Look, you can't just experiment your way through emotions, I said, trying to steady my breathing. It's about connection, and right now, you're just pushing buttons to see what happens. That's not how human relationships work. The situation had escalated quickly. Zyra and Kira, the two alien sisters, seemed completely convinced that they were on the verge of discovering some earth-shattering truth about human emotions. Unfortunately, their understanding of how emotions worked was still wildly off the mark. The idea that physical proximity and firmness were the key to unlocking human emotional depth was a misconception, and they were pushing it way too hard. So, Kira began, leaning in again, her voice lower and more intense this time. If attraction is not the main factor, then what is it? How do you humans decide who is worthy of closeness? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. This was getting more complicated by the minute. It's not about worthiness, I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. It's about compatibility. We connect with people who share our values, interests, and yes, emotional openness. But it's more than just physical attraction. Zyra frowned, her eyes narrowing as she processed my words. So, you're saying that firmness isn't the most important part of human connection? I shook my head. No. It's part of it, but it's not the only thing that matters. There's emotional depth, mutual respect, trust. You can't just be firm or strong. You have to be open. Kira tilted her head, clearly intrigued but still missing the point. And how do we test this openness? I groaned internally. You can't really test openness. It's not a controlled experiment. It's something that happens over time. It's about getting to know someone, letting them in, emotionally. Zyra crossed her arms, clearly frustrated. So, there's no quick way to measure it? No, I said firmly. And it's not something you can just force either. But we must understand it. Kira insisted, her voice sharp with urgency. If we do not understand your emotional state fully, how can we ever connect with your species? How can we achieve unity? I stared at her, trying to keep my cool. Look, you can't force emotional connection. It has to happen naturally. You can't just walk up to someone and expect them to open up immediately. Relationships, real, meaningful ones, take time. Zyra looked at Kira, exchanging a quick glance. But your species, your kind of relationship, is built on trust. How do we earn that trust from you? It was clear they were becoming more desperate to crack the code of human connection. They were asking the right questions, but they were still fundamentally misunderstanding everything. This wasn't science, it was human nature, and there was no easy answer. I leaned back, trying to think of a way to explain it. Trust is earned, Kira. It's not something you can just demand. It's about being there for someone, showing them you care, being vulnerable yourself. I paused, trying to find the right words. You want to understand human emotional response, but you have to stop treating everything like an experiment. You can't just test trust. You build it. Zyra seemed unconvinced. And how do we build trust? How do we prove to you that we can be trusted? It was frustrating, but I knew I had to explain it. You build trust by being honest. By being open with someone. By respecting their boundaries and making them feel safe. It's about understanding each other, not about dominating or controlling. I know that's not what you want to hear, but that's how it works. Kira stepped back, clearly thinking over my words. But Zyra, being the more headstrong of the two, wasn't letting go of her initial hypothesis. But there must be another way. There must be a way to make this process quicker. We are advanced. Our species has perfected many things. Why can't we perfect this? I rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. Perfection doesn't exist in human relationships. There's no shortcut to connection. That's what makes it so real. Zyra's gaze softened for a moment. I could tell she was struggling with this concept, but she wasn't quite ready to give up on her initial assumptions. If we are to understand your species fully, we must try different methods, she said with finality, her voice not quite as sure as before. But you claim trust is key. I nodded. Yes, trust is everything. You can't force people to trust you, just like you can't force someone to love you. You have to show them you're trustworthy. Kira stepped forward again, this time with a bit more caution in her movements. So if we prove our trustworthiness, you will open up to us? She asked, almost as though testing the words. I hesitated. This was getting into dangerous territory. The whole situation felt increasingly like I was being caught in some strange alien game of emotional chess, and I had no idea what the stakes were. But I also couldn't deny that there was something oddly endearing about their earnestness. Yes, I said, forcing a calm tone. But it's not just about me trusting you. It's about you understanding what trust means. It means respecting someone's boundaries, listening to them, and most importantly, not rushing things. Zaira and Kira exchanged another look, and I could see the wheels turning in their minds. They were taking it all in, but whether they fully understood what I was saying was still up in the air. So, the key is patience, Kira said slowly, almost as if trying to convince herself. Exactly, I replied, relieved to see she was starting to get it. You can't rush emotional connection. It has to develop naturally, over time. Zaira's expression softened a little more. So, we must prove we can be trusted. And trust will lead to emotional connection. I nodded again. Yes, exactly. That's the first step. Once you have trust, everything else follows. The sisters stood there in silence for a moment, processing everything I had said. I could tell they were both still very much in the dark, but they were at least trying to understand. There was a strange, almost comical tension in the air as they tried to grasp the concept of emotional vulnerability and connection. I had no idea what kind of experiments they would come up with next, but for the first time, I felt like I was starting to make progress. Maybe, just maybe, these alien sisters would learn that human emotions couldn't be analyzed or measured like physical traits. Maybe, after all this, they would understand the one thing that made us different from every other species in the galaxy. We weren't perfect. But we were capable of something they couldn't even begin to comprehend: real emotional connection. After what felt like hours of back and forth, I was beginning to lose track of time. Zaira and Kira had finally accepted that emotional connection was about trust and time, and yet the strange feeling of being a lab rat in their twisted little experiment was still hanging over me. The sisters seemed determined to prove something that, frankly, I wasn't sure could be proven. They wanted to understand human emotion in a way that seemed both naive and utterly bizarre. The silence in the room was oppressive, each of us stuck in our own thoughts. But Zaira broke the silence first, her voice tinged with a mixture of frustration and curiosity. So you say it's about trust. But if we've established trust, then why is it so difficult to achieve this connection you speak of? I took a deep breath, trying to calm the growing frustration in me. Because trust doesn't mean you're automatically going to feel something for someone. That's not how human emotions work. You can't just flick a switch and say, now we're connected. It's a process. And this process, Kira added, leaning forward slightly, requires time? Yes, I said, my patience thinning. Time, space, and a willingness to get to know each other. You can't rush human emotions. Relationships, whether romantic or otherwise, don't work that way. Zaira's eyes narrowed as she processed the information. So you're saying, we must invest time in this connection? How much time? I blinked, caught off guard by the question. It's not about a specific amount of time. It's about building a foundation. You can't force it. Kira's voice cut through the air again, sharp with an eagerness that was almost palpable. But we want to understand your kind. If this emotional connection is as important as you say, we need to explore it more. We need to experience it firsthand. At this, I couldn't help but chuckle nervously. Oh no, I see where this is going. You're not going to try and make me fall in love with you or anything, are you? Zaira didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, her expression turning serious. We're not asking you to fall in love with us, human. We're trying to understand the process behind emotional bonding. Your species values these connections, yet we cannot comprehend them with our current understanding. I ran a hand over my face, exhausted. This is insane. I muttered under my breath. You can't just study love like you're looking at a microscope slide. That's not how it works. Then how do we experience it? Kira asked, her voice softer now, as if she were truly seeking an answer. I leaned back, staring up at the ceiling, trying to gather my thoughts. It was one thing to explain these concepts to them, but another to see them actually trying to understand. The sincerity in their eyes, despite all their quirks and missteps, gave me a brief moment of hesitation. Were they actually trying? Or was this all just another experiment for them to catalog and move on from? You have to open yourselves up to it, I said finally, my voice a little more resigned than before. You can't control when it happens, or who you feel connected to. You can't force it. Kira seemed to absorb this, her brows knitting together. So it's about letting go of control? Exactly, I replied, relieved that they seemed to be getting it. If you try to control everything, then you're never really connecting. You're just playing a game. Zaira's eyes softened slightly. Then, we need to stop trying to manipulate the process. It felt like a victory, small though it was. Yes. You can't just control every variable. That's not what relationships are. There was a brief pause as the sisters exchanged a look that I couldn't quite decipher. For a moment, it seemed like they were beginning to truly understand. I let out a sigh, relieved to be done with this strange, confusing interaction. But if we can't control it, Kira said, her voice quiet now, then how do we know when we've made a connection? How do we know when we've found someone who is compatible? I ran my fingers through my hair, feeling the weight of the conversation. You don't. That's the thing. You can't know right away. It's about spending time together, feeling the other person's emotions, seeing how they react to you. It's trial and error, and it's messy. And how do we manage the mess? Zaira asked, her voice almost curious. How do we navigate all of these feelings without overwhelming ourselves? I blinked, taken aback by her question. It was clear now that they weren't just trying to catalog human emotions. They were trying to understand them. I wasn't sure whether to be impressed or disturbed. You have to be patient with yourself and with the other person. Relationships aren't clean and neat. They're complicated, and sometimes things get messy. You have to be okay with that. Zaira nodded slowly, processing my words. Messy, yes, we understand. But you're telling us that this mess is necessary. We must allow ourselves to get tangled up in it. Exactly, I said, trying to make them see how much was involved in human relationships. If you're afraid of the mess, then you'll never make a real connection. Sometimes you have to get a little lost to find something real. For a moment, there was silence again, and I could feel the weight of their scrutiny. I wasn't sure if they understood fully, but I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to get the gist of it. I think I understand now, Kira said, her voice barely above a whisper. Connection isn't just about strength, or even about emotional control. It's about vulnerability, and letting go of that control. Zaira nodded. And we must be willing to embrace the messiness of it all. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Yes. Exactly. There was a long pause, and I wondered if they were finally starting to grasp the complexity of human relationships. They had come here to study us, our biology, our strength, our emotions, but now, it felt like they were truly beginning to understand what made us human. The messiness, the vulnerability, the unpredictable nature of connection, they were starting to see it. So, Kira said, her voice more hesitant now, do we test this? Can we try? I shook my head, holding up a hand. You can't test emotional connection. It doesn't work like that. It happens when it happens. Zaira gave a small smile, the first one I'd seen from her that didn't feel entirely forced. Then we will have to wait for it. I nodded. Exactly. You can't rush it. The sisters stood there, a quiet understanding between us now, their expressions softening. Maybe, just maybe, they would take these lessons with them. And maybe, just maybe, they had learned that true emotional connection couldn't be quantified or measured. It wasn't about tests, or firmness, or manipulation. It was about trust, vulnerability, and time. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I thought maybe this whole bizarre experience hadn't been a complete waste of time after all.